And it says it's working. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our Parsha study. It is a new year, yay! And that means we are reading a new book. Well, not exactly. What's that? Well, good, but they're a little late, so we're going to go ahead and keep going. We are reading back from the beginning of the Torah, but I am going to try, week in, week out, to try and sprinkle in a few more passages or references to commentary on other parts of the Tanakh as well. I've been teaching the Parasha now here for 8 years, and I think we've covered many of the main things, but I want to make sure that your understanding of the rest of the Tanakh, the rest of the Bible, also deepens. And so we're going to look just bits here and there at other passages that hopefully will have some connection to the Torah portion, so that way it broadens your understanding of the rest of the Bible. Everyone's good with that?
So, should we have a Tanakh?
We don't have enough Tanakhs for the whole class. I have very carefully for today chosen a piece of the Tanakh that is in one of the Haftarot. So that's my way of sneaking it in. But if there's ever a larger passage that is not in the Chumash, then I will make sure to include it on the handout.
Oh.
But everyone should have their own Tanakh, of course. I just don't necessarily expect everyone to bring it to class. In class, I always try to provide you everything you need here, so no one should feel bad if they forgot their copy at home, and God forbid say, "Oh, I forgot my copy. I can't come." Always come.
Oh.
All right. So we are in the book of Bereishit, and we are going to talk about, we're going to talk about something that a lot of people don't actually ever bother reading, because they get caught up after the story of Cain and Abel with the, and then so-and-so had so-and-so, and so-and-so had so-and-so, and they start flipping pages until they get to Noah. So we're going to take a little slice and show you just how deep it can be. And also one of the main controversies on a very small slice. Okay, so we are going to take a look at page 28. We are on chapter 4. And we're going to do a little bit of the begats, only because we need to get the contrast between that and what's about to happen. Our main focus is actually going to be over on 25 and 26, but we need to get a little bit of a running jump. So, do I have a volunteer to read the English so that I have someone to interrupt? Andrew, thank you.
Starting on top of the page.
Yep, Cain knew.
Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, right? And he founded a city and named the city after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael.
Are you beginning to regret volunteering to read?
No, I'm being challenged. Okay.
So I have to confess, most of the English versions of these names sound like gibberish to me. The Hebrew is so much easier. So, for example, Hanoch is much easier than Enoch, and Mehujael is much easier than, what do they say? Mehujael? Yeah. So
sounds almost Persian to me.
Well, but I personally think Mehujael is a little bit easier to work now. Now, the next one is a little bit easier because it's more familiar.
Begot Methusiel, and Methusiel begot Lamech. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. Adah bore Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who dwell in tents and amidst herds. And the name of his brother was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the pipe. As for Zael, she bore Tubal Cain, who forgot all.
Who forged
all implements of copper and iron. And the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah.
Okay, so got all those names? That we need a family tree, and you can easily find those online.
Yeah.
But one thing I just want to point out, none of those people matter, because they're all going to be dead, and all of their descendants are going to be dead, because the flood's coming. right? So the Torah is giving us their whole chain, even though it may sound like these are people who began the nomadic societies, and these are the people who began the music societies, and these are the people who began cities, and these are the people who did forging and all of that. That's great, but them and their descendants all died.
But we kept their teachings.
Well, so that's a whole other line of commentary of exactly what do you mean by we're the people who play music are come from them if they're all gone. But yes, the general line would be that they began many of these talents, and those talents either were passed on as knowledge rather than genetics, or that those talents were rediscovered after the flood with a new line of humanity. But it is very interesting that the Torah wants to share with us something about these early lineages of man, even though that lineage is going to get wiped, erased, deleted, expunged.
What's the L on those names? Mm-hmm. Are those references to God?
Those are references to God. Whether you want to put a capital G or a lowercase g may be a topic that we're going to come up with in just a few more verses. What was the religion of these early people is going to come back to be a bit of our focus for today. Because after all, we know what Cain's religion was, right? At least at the start. Who did Cain worship? God, capital G God, right? Elohim, because he learned from his parents, Cain's parents, once again, famous name, famous couple, the ultimate power couple, right? The beautiful people, right? Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, right? So they were definitely on a first name basis, you might say, with God, capital G God. And then Cain and Abel both also were worshiping God. That's where we get the first sacrifice, which doesn't work out so well. And now we have to ask, what is the religion? What is the relationship of these people to God? So far, we haven't heard anything godly-ish about them, except for maybe parts of their name referring to El, which could be referring to God, or it could just be referring to might and strength, which is where in the ancient Semitic languages the word El derives from. It doesn't mean just generic God, it means powerful, which is why even human beings can sometimes be called Elohim, not as any sort of disrespect, but again, as I think I might have mentioned in a few other classes, it's similar to the English word Lord. Lord can be a lowercase L, Lord, the Lord of the Manor, right? He is the Lord of Dance. And we're not talking about any sort of godlike powers, but we're just talking about mastery. And they can also be capital L Lord, meaning the creator of heaven and earth. So it's a little unclear what their faith was like. And their character is not quite clear yet. So let's go ahead and take a look and see if their character gets revealed as we go on. So now we're at the top of page 29, verse 23.
And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, O wives of Lamech. Give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold.
Okay, so this is some controversy, but much of the historical commentary points out that this is very similar to other ancient Near Eastern boasts. Right, this is the graffiti of the ancient world, of what you'd see, scrawled as an inscription among some 2-bit Asiatic potentate, who's basically saying, "Look at me and despair," Osmandius poem reference. So, what is Lamech basically saying? He's saying to his ladies, "Hey, see how buff I am? Right? Some guy insulted me, and I murdered him." Right? Because that is showing how buff you are in certain hierarchical structures, right? If people know that just insulting you is going to end up getting them killed, then that means people don't mess with you. That was a very important survival strategy in many ancient cultures. To be the most bloodthirsty was to be the one who would be least harassed. Of course, that meant you always had to be prepared to kill the person, and you also had to be prepared that if people thought you were that bloodthirsty, they might try to kill you first, rather than worry about what your reaction might be. Which is why he puts in, if Cain is going to be avenged sevenfold, who's doing that avenging, by the way? Who's Cain's avenger? God, exactly, right? When Cain is told that he is going to have to be a wanderer, he says, if I do that, then anyone can kill me because there'll be no one to do justice for me, because no one ever does justice for strangers, not until Torah comes along and tells us we should. But, Cain didn't think like that, because after all, he didn't even think about justice for his brother. So Cain says, if I'm a stranger, then everyone's just going to kill me. And God says, don't worry. If anyone lays a hand on you, I will punish them 7 times over. That's God's guarantee that Cain's punishment is not meant to be death. Cain's punishment is meant to be a wanderer. What is Lamech saying? He's like, yeah, if Cain has God in his corner, given 7-fold retribution to anyone who might mess with him, I've got me, and I do 77-fold, right? Which is basically, again, don't mess with me. Okay.
But when they say, I have slain a man for wounding me, is it just he verbally might have insulted him or challenged him, or did he physically attack him?
It could be either, but in either case...
It might have been a self-defense issue. And, there's a lot...
Indeed, if someone is actually trying to kill you, then killing them in return is perfectly justified by the Torah's system of morality. However, if someone takes and punches you, and you pull out a gun and shoot them dead, the Torah says overreaction, right? If you're having like just a dust up with somebody, right? You get angry, you fly off the handle, you punch them, and the guy says, all right, bam. That is not acceptable by Torah. Yes, I know in America we have arguments about stand your ground laws, but the whole issue of bringing a gun to a knife fight or bringing a gun to a fist fight is not something the Torah approves of, right? If someone is just having a wrestle with you, right, which was common again in our pre-modern society where people would get into, fist fights all the time. I mean, how many old movies have you guys seen? Not Old West. I'm talking like, New York 1940s movies, where someone insults you and you take out and wham, you deck them. Imagine that guy gets up and shoots them. Do they say, oh, well, that was reasonable self-defense? No, if someone punches you, you get to punch them back. If someone tries to kill you, then yes, you can kill them back. And what Lamech is saying here is that, no, he would have tried to kill somebody just for hurting him. And that's not the hierarchy that's supposed to exist unless you're trying to be a total, I'm trying to think of a polite way because we don't have polite words for those kinds of people. If we're trying to be a total hard nose, is perhaps, but it's pointing at the wrong side of the body for the way we normally would express that in English.
What is that a misprint where it has an 11 multiple from 7 to 77?
Is that a misprint?
Well, I mean, I just felt out as weird when it went from 7 to 77.
Yeah, it's hyperbole. Because it's 777. It's like, it's...
I didn't think they were on the decimal system.
I don't know about decimal, but it's basically trying to say it is so much more over the top. And since 7 is one of those great paradigm numbers in biblical poetry, getting to use 2 7s back to back in your number sounds even bigger. Right? This goes to 11.
All right. But 7 twice in a row would be.
Yep. But 7 twice in a row would be 14. I know my math is good enough for that. But 7 twice in a row wouldn't sound as cool as 77.
Oh no, I was just wondering. It's not a decimal system, though, is it? Like the deca. Groups of 10s? No. It's I mean they knew what 10s were and all of that, but I mean it's 77 lets you use the word 7 twice. Yeah. Which is a cooler sounding number in biblical poetry than saying 14. Or even 80, which is even more than 77. 77 sounds like a beautiful, round, totally enormous number. I know. Our poetic system is different. But think of how we resonate to words like 20 or 12. Why should a dozen matter? Right? Is a dozen really better than 13? No, but if you say there were 2 dozen people there, people will go, oh wow, 2 dozen people. And if you say there were 2 groups of 13 people, what? Right? Language and numbers, they go together in ways that don't always make math sense. Okay, now we get finally to our main event. That was a lot of build-up.
Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. It was then that men began to evoke the Lord by name.
Okay, but that's a period, right? Began to invoke the Lord by name. All right, so we had this whole line coming out of Cain, and no line coming out of Abel because he's dead. And now we switch back to Adam and Eve again, and we find out they have a third kid after the murder of Abel. And there's many long discussions in the Midrash of why they did and how they did and when they did and all of that. But suffice it to say, they have this third son. His name is Seth, or Shet in the Hebrew, and because he is an additional seed, he is added to what had been lost, and his line now is begun. Right, the lineage that he will give. Now his line, spoiler alert, this is the one that will continue. This is the survivor's line that will eventually lead to Noah, and from Noah, of course, through the flood, that will be the survivor's branch. So learning a little bit about them and learning a little bit about them in contrast to the other group we just described might be important. So what do we find out? What immediate bit of information do we get about this line that is different than what we just got from the other guy's line?
They evoke the Lord. They pray. They have some kind of religious observance, something.
That is what the English seems to indicate, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 The Hebrew is not so clear.
The
The Hebrew is not so clear because we get this wonderful word here, uchal. Right? So that this is enosh, there's that uchal likro, right? That they something to call on the name of God. Now, first of all, we get the actual name of God, the Yud He Vav He, which is a little bit of a novelty at this point. But it's unclear what is actually going on here. The commentaries are quite divided on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Thankfully, in Radak's commentary, he gives us a bit of a summary of the different positions that could be at play here. So if the handouts can make their way around. Just one page, front and back. You're all set? Yeah, I went both directions. All right, so we have this argument about the word huchal. Now, Andrea, don't worry about doing the Hebrew, just do the English around it and we'll all be good. So, some commentators.
Okay, some commentators understand the word in the sense of desecrating, profaning.
Right, we might be familiar with the word chilul, right? That is to desecrate something. So some of them are reading this as being a conjugation. That may be my technical assistant letting me know there's a problem with the system. Or it may be something completely unrelated. Okay. I always have to check because I never know about the technology. Yeah. So this may be the idea that they are desecrating God's name. That's one way to read this verb. Others, however,
others, including Rashi, understand it in the sense of beginning,
which is what our English translation has done. Right? So once again, our English translation has removed all ambiguity that's found among the commentators of whether this is beginning or desecrating, and then they just go, beginning, write beginning down, and we're done. So, and we get even more, in my opinion, leaning towards this answer by using the great phrase invoke, right? It doesn't actually say invoke in Hebrew, right? That's not there's like, right, avoke, it's not a word, right? It says bikro, right, which literally means to call, right? So they call by the name of God. That is a much more ambiguous phrase than invoke, right? Usually when we think of invoking, it's pleading, it's praying, it's reaching out to, it's somehow calling for help from. Call could be a little bit more unclear. So how does this work? Well, let's go according to the one version.
In
Onkelos first. Yeah.
In Onkelos?
Onkelos. So this is one of the earliest Aramaic translations. Onkelos.
Onkelos. Onkelos.
Yes.
That's a good word.
Onkelos?
Not your Antelus, your Onkelos.
I know, like Onkelos. We find two versions. According to one version, people became lax in worshiping God in the days of Enosh.
So
According,
that's one version. I told you you had to be prepared to be interrupted. So that's one version, which is they are beginning to desecrate the name of God. They are beginning to, call his name in inappropriate ways, that they are beginning to become unfit users of God's name. Because after all, this argument goes, how could it be that they are only now beginning to use the name of God in worship? What were Cain and Abel doing when they started their worship? Right? It doesn't make sense to think that God was talking to Adam and Eve, God talked to Cain and Abel, and then suddenly the whole world stops. And then after they have Seth and Seth's kid, now they suddenly get religion? What were they doing in the meantime? So this version says it wasn't that they were starting here. This is the beginning of the end. This is where the religion they had, what had driven Cain and Abel to offer sacrifices, this is where that has begun to peter out, where the religion they had is now being treated badly. That people are calling God's name, but they're doing so in ways that are bad. And we know that that's certainly possible because it's one of the things the Ten Commandments prohibits, right? To misuse God's name is one of the prohibitions. So that is what this line of reasoning argues is happening here. Everyone follow that opinion?
But they didn't have the commandments.
Oh, they didn't have the commandments, but they knew some things were what God wanted and some things were not what God wanted. We know that because of the whole incident with the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. We also know that because of what happens with Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the garden. And we also know that because God is about to bring down that big hammer of the flood, which can only happen if he's holding us accountable for actions that we've committed.
So inherently they would have something inside of them to know righteousness?
Either inherently or have been taught by their ancestors, by Adam and Eve and the other generations. So it's a bit of a question of whether people were inherently understanding of what was right or wrong, or whether they were receiving at least some tidbits from the first generations, which we're not that far from. Right? For Enosh, it's actually his grandparents, or whether there was something inside. So both could work, but there definitely seems to be an assumption by this first opinion that people started off knowing what was right and wrong, more or less. Not perfectly, but at least knew what was right or wrong, even if they didn't always do it. And now it's beginning to get worse and worse and worse, which is a prelude to the deluge. Okay, on the other hand.
according to the other version of Onkelos, in Enosh's days, people began to proclaim the name of God.
Right, so this is the positive version. The people are beginning to call out to God, and that this is somehow a new development.
If the second interpretation is correct, the decline of religious observance was arrested for the first time in the days of Enosh, when people found it necessary to pray to God when they found themselves in trouble. Up until that time, they had not even thought that prayer could be helpful in affecting their fate on earth. They considered God's decree as irreversible under any circumstances.
All right, so remember how I maybe overplayed the idea of how could they suddenly get religion now? Well, Rashi and the others make a very good case for it, which is if you were Adam and Eve and God tells you, you shouldn't have eaten that, get out, did they pray? No. When God says, you're going to have to work for a living and childbirth is going to be painful now and it's going to have troubles and all, did they pray to God to forgive them? No. Right? And in the intermediate, when Cain did what he did and all of that, did he say, God, don't punish me at all? No. He begged a little bit for mercy, which was the start of it. But here we begin to say, says Rashi, we begin to see that people are actually saying, if we pray and maybe try to connect to God, maybe we don't have to be rotten. Maybe things don't have to be bad. It's a beginning of the idea that this relationship is actually meant to be a mutual connection, not just you messed up, you messed up, you messed up, you messed up, and just keep getting worse and worse and worse. Unfortunately, it's not going to be enough, as we'll find out, because the flood eventually happens. But the idea that this is starting to drop that in is a very powerful one. And one of the things that lends itself to that, of course, is the fact that the name that they are using is the name Adonai, which by all of our traditional accounts is the name that is referred to more when we're reaching out for the compassionate and merciful aspects of God in our relationship, as opposed to Elohim, when we are seeing more of the judicial side of God's aspect in our world. Make sense? Okay, onward.
According to what we have seen in the writing of our sages, Shabbat 118.
That's in the Talmud. That's the Talmud.
Okay. And according to the understanding of most people, that idolatry was widespread in the days of Enosh. The meaning of the verse before we must be that in Enosh's time, many people began to look upon the celestial phenomena as deities and address them and worship them as gods.
All right, so here we get the idea of what kind of desecration could it really begin to happen, because don't people know God? I mean, like we said, this is like, you know, Adam and Eve are grandparents here, so it's not, excuse me. Just gonna turn that off. It's not like people have never heard of God. We're still so close to the beginning that it's impossible to think people have forgotten it. But instead, what the desecration could be is not getting rid of God from their consciousness, but of adding other things around God, the heavenly court, if you will, that they begin to worship as well as God, which eventually becomes instead of God. So he plays that out for us.
They did so because they considered this phenomena as intermediaries between them and the invisible God. Seeing that these phenomena had been appointed by God to run the terrestrial part of the universe on his behalf, they considered these forces as capable of bestowing favors on those worshiping them.
Right? So, you know, you imagine you've got a king, and the king appoints governors to each of the little provinces, and the governors appoint mayors to each of the little villages. So if you need something done, it's hard to go talk to the king, you think. The king is so far away. What do? I go to the mayor. And if I make the mayor like me, then the mayor will clearly have the authority to change my lot. Because, you know, after all, the king put him in charge. So all I have to do is make the mayor like me. That could just be being nice to the mayor. That could mean corruption, bribing, sacrifices, building a nice statue of the mayor, saying good things about the mayor or about the governor. Or what happens if there's more than one person that I think I need to get approval from? This is how corruption in political systems works. This is also how corruption of religious systems work. And so this is the model that Radak is drawing from. It's most famously expounded by Rambam.
I was going to say, would this be even the start of bribing officials?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, as soon as somebody was put in charge, someone else had the idea of bribing them.
Yeah.
Right? Once someone's in charge and has the authority to make decisions with no immediate oversight, then bribes are an automatic human response.
It would give you gifts.
Well, and the underlying flaw, of course, is that you believe that that person is in charge more than the person who put them in charge. And when that happens in a government, that's very corrosive. When that happens in religion, that becomes idolatry. Because now you have said that this low-level divine functionary is somehow as important or more important to me personally than the distant king.
Gradually, such initial errors spread until most forms of idolatry nowadays are totally devoid of any rationale.
Meaning people may have done it initially because of this reason of God appointed this person, blah, 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 but eventually people forget about God, they forget about the king, and they're just doing it because that's what they've always done. They stick with idolatry out of habit rather than theology.
In people's minds, natural forces are perceived as competing with each other and possessing overlapping domains, so that unless one worships at least several of them, one would arouse jealousy of one ignored.
Right? You don't want to give the gift to the wrong person. You want to give a gift to enough people, so that way they'll all be your friend.
The matter has become so grotesque that man-made statues that neither see, hear, etc., are credited with being able to influence the lives of intelligent human beings. Which,
if you are enjoying our singing of Hallel all during the Chag of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah, you'll remember that that is exactly the lines of the Psalms. Of they have mouths but cannot speak, eyes and cannot see, ears and cannot hear, and all those that worship them end up like them. And that's exactly the model that Radak is describing here. Okay, so calling on God, it's unclear what's happening here. Are people beginning to pray, or are they beginning to actually slip as they desecrate what it means to call on God by adding on all of this idolatrous stuff? It's still a little unclear, but what is clear is that definitely the potential for human beings to do what they did, whether it happened at this verse or whether it happened earlier or whether it happened later, that potential is definitely there, because all of us can read this and say, yeah, that sounds like what people would end up doing. If you didn't have some way to stop it, some way to check that momentum, turning to this type of behavior, which is going to take us to another part of the Tanakh. If you will take a look at page 1267. 1267. We are in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 1.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan, together with all his people, into the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads, I give to you as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness and the Lebanon to the great river, the river Euphrates, the whole Hittite country, and up to the Mediterranean Sea on the west. No one shall be able to resist you as long as you live. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you.
All right. So very, very powerful vote of confidence from God to Joshua, who has now taken over because, as it says very clearly, Moses is dead. In fact, we get Moses dying twice in the first two verses, which might seem, pardon the expression, like overkill. Sorry, too soon. But the question is, why is God having this discussion with Joshua now? I mean, surely all of these instructions have already been given. Joshua already knows that their job is now to cross the Jordan to settle the land of Israel and to allow the tribes to disperse into their territories. Why does any more speech need to be given? Including what goes on. Or did you want to add a comment there?
I think, he's speaking to God now. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not from Moses. It's not from another human. It's God.
He is now the man, right? The direct line, which is putting him in a position that he has not been in before. So this speech may be, in fact, the first time he has heard this from God directly. He heard from Moses what God wanted him to do, but this is probably the first time that he is feeling God's presence the way, at least to some degree, that Moses felt while Moses was still alive. But one more little bit of paragraph to give him some guidance.
Be strong and resolute, for you shall apportion to this people the land that I swore to their fathers to assign to them. But you must be strong and resolute to observe.
Noticing a pattern? Be strong, be resolute, be strong, be resolute.
To observe faithfully all the teaching that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Let not this book of the teaching cease from your lips, but recite it day and night, so that you may observe faithfully all that is written in it. Only then will you prosper in your undertakings, and only then will you be successful. I charge you, be strong and resolute. Do not be terrified or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
All right, wherever you go. So that is an amazing pep talk, right? I mean, this is like the halftime in the Super Bowl, and God comes out and says, all right, I know our star quarterback Moses is dead, but we're going to get into that end zone, second half, and you're the guy to lead us there, Joshua. And it's like, the coach never talked to me before. But now, you know, I'm second string quarterback. I'm being called up, and I'm going to finish this game, and the coach believes in me, and we're going to do this. And then God says, quite emphatically, and here's the playbook of the dead quarterback. Use it. That's all. Do his plays. What does that mean about the new quarterback?
That is not to deviate. And God was building up his confidence.
He's not, okay, so the confidence we got, but when you tell me I can't change one of Moses's plays, I can't run my own plays, I can't call an audible. Well, but why? I'm the quarterback now, right?
Were these really Moses's plays?
Well, definitely this is considered by God's instructions to say, this is what I told Moses, you will do what I told him. But if I'm the new quarterback, why can't I do what you tell me? Why do I still need his playbook? Why can't you and I, God, why can't we work on the playbook and add more to it, and we'll come up with our own plays for this whole, you know, settling the land of Israel? It seems, you know, almost comical. But in every other situation, that would be exactly what we would expect to happen. I mean, every other non-God situation, right? We would expect that if there was the board of directors and the old CEO just resigned and they made a new person CEO, they wouldn't hand him the CEO's guidebook to running the corporation and say, okay, we want you to do what the last CEO did from now on. And he's like, oh, good. I've been wanting to change. No. Don't go left, don't go right. You do exactly what he wrote down. It's like, yeah, but, you know, we, the board and I, we have this relationship now. We can work out changes. No, no, it's unusual, which is why we need a midrash to explain it. And why we need to see that we should remark that this is unusual. Because if there's a midrash to explain something, that always means the rabbis thought it was unusual. Right, that's the great thing about our sages, is when something was unusual or deviated from the normal human behavior, they didn't just say, oh, no, don't look at that. They said, let's look at that and figure out why that happened and what it must have been like for Joshua and the people of Israel to go through this transition.
I was just going to say, this must have been terrifying for the people.
After 40 years?
After 40 years, and you knew that he had direct lines to Moses. You know, and he's reviewed everything. He's like the eternal death speeches that go on and on and on. And I can imagine even Joshua, but if you remember, Joshua also stood at the base of the mountain.
Mm-hmm. Not at the top of the mountain and not with the people. He was in between.
Was always kind of like.
And so the question is, with the guy who could call to God, right? Called by God's name. Better than anyone's ever seen anyone ever called by God's name, in every positive sense of that term that we were discussing earlier. What's going to happen when he's out of the game? Is Joshua going to bring that same kind of game? Does Joshua have that same responsibility? Does that have that same ability? That's what we need to figure out. And that's what our sages are going to try and walk us through.
Joshua thereupon gave orders.
Nope, back to the handout. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Back to the handout. No. Joshua goes to it. No problem. Which is why the rabbis go, wait a minute. There had to be more to it than just like the pep talk at halftime. There had to be some give and take that was happening here for Joshua to be able to step up like this. So that's where they're going to fill us in.
There is no prophet who can be believed to the greater extent than Moses was before the revelation at Mount Sinai, through the giving of signs alone.
Right, so starting right off the bat, he's saying, even before they got to Sinai, Moses was already the top prophet anyone had ever seen, and everyone was willing to believe him even before the whole Mount Sinai thing, because of all the signs and wonders he'd done, right? Everything that we saw in Egypt, for example. How do we know that people were willing to believe him? Examples?
Well, even before that time, Moses had been believed in respect to certain details of Pesach, and a prophet is not to be believed to institute a mitzvah for all time, as our sages have stated. These are the mitzvahs, and a prophet may not institute anything after this.
Right, so very important. The Torah itself says that after Moses and after the mitzvot were given, prophets are not allowed to change those mitzvot forever, right? And so when Moses says, this is how we're going to do Pesach from now on, forever, when they're still living in Egypt, he's acting with full, universal, eternal prophetic power, which no one else ever gets. That makes Moses rather special. And that's going to make Joshua second best.
He is not even believed to rule upon any matters in the Torah unresolved by the sages, as is indicated in the
Gemara.
Gemara.
Okay. Gemara. Okay, but pause real quick. What does that mean? So let's imagine we have another prophet, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, any of the prophets that you guys know. And that prophet comes up and says, well, you know, I know there's an argument about whether we say 5 cups or 4 cups for the blessing during the Seder. That's where the cup of Elijah comes from, by the way. So he says, it's okay, I've talked with God. And even though we don't have a solution from Moses, and we don't have a solution from the sages, I've talked to God, and God says we only do 4. The nation would say, thank you very much, Mr. Elijah. No. We will believe you about what we should do today. We'll believe you about the vision that you have of the future. But we're not going to believe you about changing a single mitzvah that we received from Moses, even if you're trying to help clarify a mitzvah that is ambiguous up to this point. Because prophets after Moses don't get that job. Only Moses gets to say, this is the way it is forever. Everyone afterwards, even prophets, don't get to say that. It's a very, very big, important Jewish theological point. Good? Good. So let's see the example in the Talmud. Yes.
Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, when Moses, our teacher, was about to enter Gan Eden,
which means die,
he said to Joshua, ask of me any doubts that you have. Joshua replied, my master, did I leave you for even one moment? It is not written in the Torah. And his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, did not depart from the midst of the tent. Immediately, Joshua's powers weakened. He forgot 300 holocausts. 300 doubts arose in his mind, and all of Israel rose against him to kill him.
Right? So Moses is there on his deathbed, or rather getting ready to walk to his death. And Moses says, all right, you know what? I'm about to die. So if you've got any questions, ask me now before I'm dead. And Joshua's like, I got this. I got this. I have been with you every single day. I know all the halakha. I know all the commandments. I am good. You go rest in peace. I'm fine. And Moses is like, okay, and leaves. At which point Joshua goes, wait a minute. Oh my God. And he forgets. He is suddenly without Moses. He is, you can say, nervous. He is insecure. He is unable to remember all the details of everything that Moses had taught him because he is no Moses. And Israel's like, look what we're stuck with now. We're coming to him with questions. And all of a sudden he's like, maybe? But no, we don't want maybe. We want answers. We want guidance. We want the halakha. We want Moses. And you're no Moses. And this is his new reality. He thought he was ready for the job. He thought he could be Moses. And he's finding out that no one is Moses but Moses. how do you deal with this? Because the people are looking for another Moses. They don't want a Joshua. They want another Moses. But there is no way to get another Moses, because if you had another Moses, the Torah would never be finished. It would constantly be being subject to possible alteration, and that doesn't work for a country. So God steps in.
And this the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, to tell you is impossible. Go and busy them with war, to turn their attention away from you, as it is written. And it was after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord said to Joshua, prepare food for yourselves. ...
Right? So when we look on page 1268, which I cut you off on because I wanted to wait for this moment, what is Joshua's response to the people after God has talked to him? Does he say to them, God is with me, and God has told me everything I need to know, and God has said to be strong, and God has said we're going to get through this? No, he's like, all right, guys, time for war. And what the rabbis are imagining is that in between God's speech to him and him turning to the people is this episode, where he is beginning to realize that he's not really up for being another Moses. And God is going, it's okay. You know, I didn't expect you to be another Moses. And the people need something to help them realize that you're not going to be another Moses. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to get them ready for war. And when they're getting ready for war, they're going to stop worrying about the doubts you're having. And that will see you through for this point, because I can't make you Moses. That's what the Talmud means when it says to tell you is impossible. Right? God can't give him more Torah. God can't make him be Moses again. He can't have the experience with him that he can have the clarity of understanding of God's will, that he could write it down as though it were permanent. So that means that his understanding is always going to be inferior to Moses's. It's just impossible to make him anything else. But what he can do is be a general, and he ends up being a very good one at that. And so that is God's instruction to him, which is you do what you can do, and you do what the nation needs you to do. And right now what that means is you're going to lead them across this river into war. Make sense? I know it may not be the answer we want, but it's the answer we get. All right, a little bit more.
And it is stated further, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, 3,000 Holocaust were forgotten in the period of mourning for Moses, our teacher. The Jews said to Joshua, ask that they be revealed to you. Joshua responded, the Torah is not in the heavens.
Right, so understand what he's saying here. They're like, Joshua, you don't remember, we don't remember, we forgot so many of the details of the mitzvot. Just go ask God. And Joshua says, the Torah is not in heaven anymore. Right? God gave us the Torah. We don't get to go back and get more of it. Right? There is no second version. There is no sequel. Right? This is it. What we've got is what we've got. It's not in heaven. But they want him. They want him to call on God. They want him to have the same relationship with God that Moses did. And he's saying, I can't do that. He's accepting the limitations of where he is now and where the world needs to be now, which is to have one Torah, one and done. Onward.
They said to Shmuel, ask. He responded, these are the mitzvot. A prophet may not institute anything after this. A prophet cannot be believed than either to institute a mitzvah or to explicate it, but only to give temporary commands alone. And Moses was believed in this respect on the basis of signs alone.
Right, but only on the signs alone for that limited period that a prophet is able to command for that temporary time. So when the prophet says, to Josiah, you should not go out to battle the Egyptians, the prophet is absolutely able to give a command for the king at that time period. But for a prophet to say, from now on, Shabbat is on Sunday, that doesn't work. The prophet is not allowed to change a mitzvah permanently in any one shape or form. They can give a command temporarily for the needs of the community based on their relationship with God and understanding of God's will. But their understanding is never equal to Moses's, which means they can never change or add anything that is a permanent universal change, because they're not Moses, right? The integrity of Moses's prophecy as being of the only eternal type, or being the only eternal type of prophecy that we have for a command that lasts for all times, is why the Torah has remained the Torah rather than the first draft that has been reworked over the last 2,000 years. Because as soon as we say, oh, any prophet can make a change like that, then you end up with 1,300 different revisions. And the Torah would no longer be our Torah. It would just be constantly in flux, and we would all argue about which was the real one, and that wouldn't go well. We have enough time arguing about the one we've got. Imagine if we all had our own favorite version. Okay. So all of this calling out and all of this connection to God gets really put into some beautiful poetry in the Tanhuma, in the Midrash. So we're going to finish up with a little bit more inspiration for this beginning of our Torah journey for this new year.
You find that when the Holy One, blessed be He, gave the Torah, it was entirely of fire, as it is said, at His right hand was a fiery law unto them. Our sages stated, the law was of fire, the parchment was of fire, its writings were of fire, the thread was of fire, as it is said, at His right hand was a fiery law, the face of the aged Moses became fiery, as it is said, and they were afraid to come nigh him. The angels who descended with it were of fire, as it is said, who makes winds thy messengers? The mountain burned with fire, and it was given within a fire-consuming fire. As it is said, for the Lord thy God is a devouring fire, and upon the earth he made thee to see his great fire. The divine word also came forth from the midst of fire.
Okay, so it's a lot of fire. And the rabbis are really, you might say, belaboring this point because they got a point that they need to make, which is the Torah itself is incredibly impressive. And the giving of the Torah is incredibly impressive. I mean, this whole storm of fire, Moses' face, a flame, angels of fire, the Torah itself as though it's written on parchment of fire, even the strings holding together the slots of Torah is fire. It's the most amazing thing ever. And now they are going to show that this was all so that they could pop that balloon. So this is all part of the setup. Yep.
Okay. When they beheld the lightning and the burning letters, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, do not imagine that they have much power. And he began to recite the words, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods.
Period. Right? So pause there. So why is God making this huge symphony of just this erupting fire drama? Precisely so he can say, all of this ain't God. Right? All of this fire, all of this thunder, all of this drama, this isn't God. God is not in the fire, and fire isn't God, and wind isn't God, and lightning isn't God, and earthquakes aren't God. Right? All of those things that other people worship as gods, they're backdrop. Right? They are not divine at all. They may be created by God. They may be the backdrop to God's great drama, but they're not worthy of being worshipped. The only thing that's worthy of being worshipped is God. And all the rest, window dressing. Right? But he had to do the big window dressing display in order to tell people, even something as amazing as this ain't me. This is not God. Right? The only thing you'll worship is me. And I don't look like fire. I don't look like thunder. I don't look like an earthquake. I don't look like a mountain. I don't look like anything because I'm not a thing. Making the point to the universe. Good? Onward.
Why were they described as gods?
That is to say, why even then call them gods? Why use the term, don't worship other gods? Why didn't God just say, don't worship stuff? Why use the term gods, which could be misleading as though it implied that they were little g gods and God was big G God? Maybe there's different scales of God. Why even use the word? Onward.
Rabbi Yosei said, He did so in order not to give the people of the world the opportunity to say that they were not called by his name, because if he had done so, it would have not acknowledged that they had power. But they were called by his name and yet have no power. When they first called upon his name, in the days of Enoch, the son of Seth, as it is said, then began man to call the name of the Lord.
All right, so we got all the way back to Bereishit, right? All the way back to Genesis. Why is it that they had to be called as gods? So that the people, meaning the idolaters, would not be able to say that they were not called by his name, meaning that they were not connected to God. Oh, sure, the Israelites, you give them your name, and then you are like, happy that they worship you, but us, you're angry at us for not worshiping you, but we didn't get your name, right? If we'd worshipped your name, then we would have done that, right? But if he had done so, it would have acknowledged that they had power, meaning these other small gods would have had power. But in fact, humanity was called by God's name. Taking the opinion of Rashi and the other scholars, Midrash Tanhuma is saying that people did know that there was God, and they lost it. They forgot it. They drifted away from it. And that is one of the great lessons of Torah and the great lessons of the high holidays, which is it takes constant renewal and rejuvenation in order to maintain our correct and clear understanding of God and how we are meant to connect to God. If you just let it go, eventually it's going to drift and warp and mutate and somehow become distorted. And maybe not in your lifetime, but by the time it's to your great-grandkids, they're going to be worshiping rocks or the stars or fire or whatever, or nothing at all, because it is that easy to lose if you don't continue to go over and over and over to keep it fresh and keep it clear, right? And that is, of course, why, even though we just finished the Torah, we are just starting it again, because we're not going to let that gap occur that might take us away. Any questions? All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.